Okay, hello comrades. I'm Lucy. I'll be chairing today's session, the latest in Counterfire's members Marxist Forums. Today we're going to hear from Kate Connelly, who is a writer and a Counterfire member, on Rosa Luxemburg and the mass strike. So Catherine's going to speak for 20 to 25 minutes, and then we'll have some time for a discussion, so questions and contributions. So do think if you have any questions that come up while Kate's speaking, do note them down, or if you've got any other points, don't be shy. Um, yeah, and then Kate will come back and we'll have some announcements, and then we can go off and enjoy the rest of the sunny day. But first, we've got a very important talk from Kate. So, Kate, would you like to start?
Thank you so much. Thanks, Lucy. And thanks everybody for coming. I I wanted just to start by saying Rosa Luxemburg was one of the most important revolutionary Marxists of the 20th century. And I wanted to start with that and with locating her there because she's somebody whose ideas have been, I think, quite often uh, misused to support positions that she really had not a lot in common with, and actually to attack a lot of the ideas that she defended all of her life. Most recently, perhaps, Rosa Luxemburg was summoned from beyond the grave by Claudia Webb in order to justify the expulsion of revolutionary socialists from your party. Um, but Rosa Luxemburg was all of her life a defender of revolutionary socialism from below. From the age of 16, when she first joined a revolutionary organization in Poland, this is where she was born, a Jewish woman born in Poland, so doubly oppressed in that sense, triply oppressed if we think about her as a woman. Poles were oppressed in the Russian Empire, and of course, Jews suffered incredible persecution under the Tsarist Empire as well. So she joined an underground revolutionary organization called Proletariat. She joined that just after much of the leadership had been arrested and some of them executed. And she continued as a revolutionary activist. She moved to Germany to be really at the center of socialist life in Europe. And one of the things for which she's most famous for was for engaging in a polemic, um, really against the established leadership of the German Socialist Party called the Social Democratic Party. People like Karl Kautsky, but also Eduard Bernstein, who I'm going to talk a little bit about. Um, and she was particularly polemicizing against the idea that was being propagated by the leadership of the party, that socialism was something that could be achieved through parliamentary action and did not require a revolution. Very famously, at the turn of the century, she publishes her polemic on this as the pamphlet Reform or Revolution, where she defends revolutionary socialism. And one of the things that I want to argue is that the pamphlet we've read for today, The Mass Strike, I think is a development of those arguments informed by a real revolutionary situation that had unfolded in Russia in 1905, the 1905 Russian Revolution. And because that unfolded across the Russian Empire, it also affected and was sharply contested also in Poland, so which Luxemburg knew very well. And in fact, right towards the end of the revolution, she manages to smuggle herself illegally back into Poland with the specific object of observing the revolution in practice. Actually, as a result of doing that, she is arrested and she is incarcerated for a number of months in very, very harsh conditions. Once she's managed to get out of Tsarist custody, she moves to Finland, where a lot of the exiled Russian revolutionaries were staying, including Vladimir Lenin. And so it's in discussion with them that she's writing this pamphlet. And in this pamphlet, she argues, it's titled The Mass Strike, she argues that the mass strike is going to become a more and more important feature of working class struggle. And she makes this argument as a critique, again, of the leadership of the SPD, of the Socialist Party in Germany. Why so? Well, because really the reference point for European socialists on this question of the mass strike, they were taking from the statements made by Friedrich Engels. So this is Engels of the first generation of revolutionary Marxists, Engels who co-authored the Communist Manifesto with Karl Marx in 1848. And he was engaging in an argument with the anarchists in the 1870s, who really argued that the only area of activity that mattered was in the workplace. And therefore, the duty of revolutionaries was simply to prepare for and to call a general strike. This really was regarded as a sort of panacea, something that would solve all of the problems and that would achieve revolutionary emancipation for all. Call a general strike, problem solved. And Engels thought this was a very crude way of looking at things and didn't really provide people with a key as to how to operate and how to act. And he also thought there was a real kind of problem with this kind of sloganeering, one of which was, well, how is this going to be prepared for, this idea of just prepare for the general strike, just prepare for this? Well, what are the powers that be? What is the nation state going to think of this? How the nation state is not going to simply allow this to take place. Or if workers were in a situation where it was so powerful, they could literally bring the whole of society to a standstill, they got all of their organizations ready, they were absolutely prepared for this, there wouldn't be the need for it. And so this was an argument that was often used in the 20th century. Also, the leadership of the SPD argued that what was taking place in Russia, where there were these huge strikes taking place, was simply not relevant to conditions in Germany. And they pointed to the social structure of Russian society. They described this as Oriental despotism. This was seen as a kind of Eastern phenomenon that had nothing to teach Western Europeans. They pointed to the fact that in Russia, they were still under the dictatorship of the Tsarist autocracy, the most repressive regime in all of Europe. It wasn't like Germany, they argued, which was a much more kind of developed capitalist society and where there was parliamentary democracy. So they said this was irrelevant, that actually what was taking place in Russia was simply an expression of how repressive that society was. And they also said there was really only one condition in which they would consider calling a general strike. And they said this would have to be used defensively and over political questions. Germany did have a parliamentary democracy. It had universal manhood suffrage. But in this period, around 1906, there were threats from the establishment to basically abolish universal suffrage. And the leadership of the SPD said, well, if that happens, then we would call a general strike. That would be the situation in which we could see this being in any way useful. It's political and it's defensive. Now, Rosa Luxemburg argued that the SPD, by arguing this, were unwittingly reproducing both the errors that Engels had been pointing out. This idea of calling the general strike from above, that essentially it would be the leadership of the SPD that one day would sit in a room and pick the date, look at their calendars and say, right, this is the day we're calling it. But also this idea of kind of incrementally preparing for something like the general strike. This is something they would build up, over the course of months. And once they've recruited enough people and worked out, have they got enough people to call it, that's when they would do it. And she said this is a completely unrealistic description of how change happens. And it certainly wasn't anything like what had been unfolding in Russia, where she was describing and looking at, examining a revolution in practice. She argues in the pamphlet you can no more call a mass strike in this way than you could call a revolution. She said it's completely unrealistic if you think about how revolutions take place. They don't take place as a result of a few revolutionaries deciding to do a kind of house-to-house canvass, knocking on people's doors. Are you ready for the revolution yet? Would you support it if it broke out on a kind of one-to-one basis? This simply is not how this kind of change takes place. So what we've got is her study here of what actually was taking place in Russia and what could be learnt from that. And what she was arguing was that the mass strike was a new development in class struggle, and that this wasn't something that had been called either by the Bolshevik Party, these Russian revolutionaries, wasn't something that had been called even by the anarchists, but also that this wasn't something that had come simply out of nowhere. The 1905 revolution was preceded by other huge destabilizing mass strikes. In other words, this comes out of a revolutionary situation, a huge crisis for the ruling regime in Russia. And she provides an account of this. She looks at the causes. What kind of sparks these mass strikes? She kind of really dates this back to the 1890s. She looks, for example, at 1896, where textile workers in St. Petersburg were told they were all being given a 3-day holiday to celebrate the coronation of the new Tsar, which would be unpaid. And that this sparks workers walking out on strike in absolute disgust. She looks at how fast these strikes spread across the Russian Empire and the ways in which they transform. So, for example, when she's writing about the 1905 revolution in Russia, she talks about the dismissal of a handful of trade unionists who worked at the Putilov ironworks in St. Petersburg, and how this sparks their workmates coming out on strike, other workers in St. Petersburg coming out on strike in their support, but how all of a sudden the demands transform from not just reinstating those few workers, but what about the 8-hour day? What about the freedom of the press? What about the freedom of speech? What about the right to organize in trade unions? And then the fact that this transforms into a huge demonstration that converges on the Tsar's Winter Palace in the city, which is then fired upon by the Tsar's troops, sparking the beginning of the 1905 revolution. It starts as a mass strike and it becomes a revolution that shakes the whole country. And in this, what she describes taking place, the dynamic that she describes, is the way in which these kind of demands translate from one thing seemingly into another. That there is a reciprocal relationship, in other words, between what might be seen as the political and the economic. That demands over wage increases can very quickly become demands for a political transformation of that society. But also the political demands, that when there's a strike that is overtly, explicitly political taking place, that gives workers across the country to come out on strike to demand a better standard of living for themselves. This is the way that Luxemburg puts it, and it's very beautifully, I think, put in the pamphlet. Every new onset and every fresh victory of the political struggle is transformed into a parallel impetus for the economic struggle, extending at the same time its external possibilities and intensifying the inner urge of the workers to better their position and their desire to struggle. After each foaming wave of political action, a fructifying deposit remains behind from which 1,000 stalks of economic struggle shoot forth and conversely. So both these things feeding one into another. And what this produces is a rapid political education of workers whose horizons are suddenly transformed, whose ideas about how to transform society, something that most, of course, workers in Tsarist Russia have been told was never going to be something they were going to be involved in. Suddenly, these are people who are now trying to seize control of their destiny. And therefore, their ideas are being transformed on a mass scale. Luxemburg describes this as political education that could not be achieved even by 30 years of handing out leaflets and writing pamphlets. So this is kind of one aspect of the pamphlet. What she also describes then is because of this kind of political education taking place, we're not talking about workers sitting down and incrementally working out the kind of cost of this. Are we prepared to kind of do this? Are we ready to do it? She describes, for example, these incredible actions of heroism in the course of these mass strikes. Probably one of the most vivid is her description of the rail workers in Kiev in 1903. After the arrest of two railway workers, she describes the way in which the wives and the families and their fellow rail workers come and sit down on the railway track. She describes this as a sea of human beings. They were threatened with being shot by the army, and the workers respond to that by baring their breasts and crying, "Shoot." And what Luxemburg here is describing, what she's saying about the mass strike, is this is the nature of the working class revolution. The earlier revolutions that had taken place across Europe, in places like France, in Germany, which had been against the feudal order, had been revolutions that she describes and that Marxists described as bourgeois revolutions. Bourgeois meaning the capitalist class and those who supported them. It didn't mean that workers weren't involved. Workers died in those revolutions, fighting in revolutionary street fighting, fighting on the barricades. But the leadership of those revolutions represented the ideals of the capitalist class, what they wanted to achieve. And therefore their demands were political, for constitutions, for the suffrage, for the vote, things like that. Questions of economics were ruled out of order. And this is done very, very starkly. I mean, they were done explicitly. If you look at the 1848 revolution, sort of classic example of this, in France, workers in that revolution were starting to raise slogans around the right to work. So saying all this talk of rights, well, what about the right to be able to feed our families? And that was eventually ruled far too controversial for the revolution to take on, that was not a right. Interfering with the so-called rights of the market would not be where the revolution was going to go. It became illegal in France in the period of that revolution to call, you could say, long live the revolution, vive la révolution, but you couldn't say long live the social revolution, because the idea was that that was translating it into these much more kind of far-reaching and economic demands. And these kind of ideas persist into the society in which we live today. It's illegal for workers to take secondary action. It's illegal for workers to say, I agree with that strike and I want it to succeed, so I'm going to strengthen that group of workers by calling a strike in my workplace. If you think about the strike wave in 2022 in this country, and a lot of the kind of the way the media kind of reported about this in horrified tones was, we think this is a political strike. We think that really, workers are saying it's about wages and the cost of living, but really you don't like the Conservative government. That's your aim, isn't it? As if workers are not allowed to have political ideas and ideas about the kind of society they want to live in and express those at work. This is really what was being said. I think also on the other side of this, when we think about the period that we've all been through, one of the weaknesses, I think, of Corbynism and of that project, which, we supported and we tried to make as successful as we could, one of the weaknesses of it was that the leadership of that project thought purely in kind of political terms. And by that, I mean in sort of parliamentary terms. They very much talked about the kind of changes they wanted to see, but talked about these simply being things that were going to be voted through in Parliament, didn't talk about how we're going to mobilize to fight for those things in wider society. How are people in their workplaces going to organize to achieve these kind of changes that we want to see? And so the working class revolution, as it was seen in Russia and as it is described so powerfully to us by Luxemburg, exposes the connection between what's sometimes described as the political and the economic. This is described, for example, in the Communist Manifesto by Marx and Engels back in 1848, when they talk about what working class revolution would look like. They say the proletariat, meaning the working class, the lowest stratum of our present society, cannot stir, cannot raise itself up without the whole superincumbent strata of official society being sprung into the air. In other words, this kind of change coming from below necessarily is an economic change, but also is going to be a change of everything else in society as well. But what this meant when Luxemburg is describing this kind of change in Russia is that just like the Russian revolutionary Leon Trotsky, she identified that the revolution in Russia, though Russia was a kind of semi-feudal society, was going to be led by the working class. Because although it was a semi-feudal society, elements of the most advanced industrialized capitalism had been exported to Russia from Europe. If you think about the Putilov works, where those workers were fired from, this was, a massive ironworks. It looked like the kind of major, big, heavy industry in parts of the most industrialized parts of Western Europe. It employed over 12,500 workers. And so you had, in some parts of Russia, a very kind of industrialized working class. And so Luxemburg is saying, actually, to the SPD, you've got a lot to learn about working class struggle from what has just been taking place in Russia. And this notion that you've got of the kind of political defensive general strike is not the struggle that we should be preparing for. It doesn't look like that. And indeed, by accepting the very idea that there is a separation between a kind of economic struggle and a political struggle, what the SPD leadership were doing was actually capitulating to the ideas of their present day society, of bourgeois society, if you like, rather than the truth that have been exposed by working class struggle. That working class liberation, in other words, is predicated on the fundamental transformation of society, at its center of which is the exploitative relationship, the exploitation of the working class, and that this requires fundamental transformation. But this then brings us to the question of leadership, because she's questioning the SPD. She's saying to the SPD, you've got this wrong. So what was she saying about the role of revolutionaries in this situation? On the one hand, she's saying it's not your role to determine the day of the general strike and to proclaim this from on high. On the other hand, she's saying it's not your role to sit back with folded arms and just to kind of watch all of this happen. But that actually your activity has to be defined by what best advances working class struggle for the achievement of its own emancipation. This is what Lukács, for example, another Marxist, describes as the actuality of revolution, from seeing your activity from that perspective. Marx expresses this also, Marx and Engels in the Communist Manifesto, when they say revolutionaries have no interests apart from the interests of the working class. So it's not determined by, oh, is this going to get us a few more seats in Parliament or anything like that. This is determined about what's going to best advance class struggle. And so it means assessing the specific situation that you're in. It means being involved in that situation. It is a polemic against this idea of revolutionaries as living in an ivory tower, and not being involved in the day-to-day struggles. And it means thinking about what are the lessons from the accumulated experiences of class struggle. So what it means is that theory and practice for revolutionaries are inseparable from each other. You can't have one without the other. And what we see here, of course, is Rosa Luxemburg in part grappling with the problem that was embodied by the SPD, which, throughout the pamphlet, they're called, the Social Democrats. And this is also the term that she applies to the left, to the socialists in Russia. But of course, the problem with the SPD, this party in Germany, was that it did contain people with ideas like Rosa Luxemburg's, but the leadership of that party was dominated by people who didn't agree with that approach, who were not revolutionaries and who did think that they could achieve socialism incrementally with all of the kind of problems that we've talked about, and simply by focusing on parliamentary activity. And that was the kind of parameters of what the party should be looking at. So Rosa Luxemburg's argument in this pamphlet here, which is very, very powerful, it's enormously useful for us, was an argument that she was having with the leadership of the party, rather than something that she was able to kind of transmit through a revolutionary party, so that the revolutionaries could kind of put this practice into, or put these ideas into practice and into action. And that, was a huge, huge problem for Luxemburg. I want to end by saying that perhaps the most kind of damning indictment of the SPD, which really exemplified the kind of problems that Luxemburg was pointing out and how far-sighted this pamphlet is to think about what happened in 1914. Socialist parties across Europe had agreed collectively that if war broke out, as it seemed like it was going to, and indeed it did, if war broke out in Europe, it was the duty of those parties to try and organize maximum resistance to that war. Everybody conceived of that as, we're going to call a general strike. If war is announced, we'll tell workers we're calling the general strike. But actually, when the war was announced, almost none of these parties did this. The revolutionary Bolsheviks in Russia stood firm against the war. But the SPD, most devastatingly of all, for everybody who looked to the SPD, it was an enormous socialist political organization, the largest in all of Europe. What did they do? They voted for war credits. Their view that they could get the changes they wanted through the nation state, as if this was somehow a kind of neutral body, translated into support for that nation state. And they made a decision that led to the destruction of millions of working class people's lives. They didn't call the general strike that they said they were going to call from on high. And indeed, of course, that was a kind of unrealistic way of thinking about things. They weren't pursuing the kind of agitation that I think is the kind of logical result from Luxemburg's pamphlet. This decision made in 1914 eventually causes a split in the European left. These ideological differences that had once been contained within parties now finds an organizational expression. There are then parties that explicitly argue socialism can be achieved through parliament, parties like the SPD, like the Labour Party in Britain, and the creation of revolutionary organizations that say socialism is something that can only be achieved by the working class itself. It has to be self-emancipation, not a few enlightened leaders. They can't achieve this through just voting in the right people into parliament. And in that debate, Rosa Luxemburg, as always, sided with the revolutionaries.